And is that just Commissioner Cranmer and our room, the two participants? Just want to make sure there's no yes yet. Yeah, okay, great. All right, call the meeting to order. Planning Commission, May 8, 2024. And Vice Chair Jan Mikayet chairing tonight as Chair Alvarez McCartney is absent, as is Commissioner LIAISON. So I will start us off with the land acknowledgement. Let's just find my way there. Yeah, to be right here in front of me. Perfect. Land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge we are on the traditional land of a rich and diverse group of native peoples who have called this area home for more than 10,000 years. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the descendants of these native peoples who are still here today. Has everyone had a chance to look at the agenda? Any changes, suggestions, comments? Okay, motion to approve the agenda as written.
I move to approve the agenda as written.
Second.
Second. Okay. Thank you. Next item, approval of meeting minutes from April 9th. Any changes, comments? I noticed one, but anyone have any comments? No. The only thing I noticed for you, Mark, is on page, well, I think it's 2 of the notes, 5 of the packet. There's a comment, or there's a point where it says Commissioner Sherry, and I think it should probably say Commissioner Panasa. So just for form, but not much else there. Okay, great.
Do you have a line item?
It was on line 7.
7.
Yeah, of page 2 of notes, 5 of the packet. All right. So moving on here. Meeting dates, any changes? I believe we have our regular meeting scheduled for next Tuesday, the 14th. Am I getting that right?
Yes, May 14th regular meeting.
Great. And as I've reminded you, I will probably miss it. I'll be returning from California right around the time the meeting starts, so highly unlikely. And the next ones, can you just remind us of the date?
We have a special meeting for comp plan on June 6th, 7 p.m. Regular meeting on June 11th, 7 p.m. And then we haven't added anything to July yet.
Great. Okay, anyone know of any conflicts already with any of those that you haven't shared previously?
I probably will miss the June 11th.
Okay. And I may miss the 6th, but it's not sure yet, so I will update the chair, Mark, as well. Let's see, I don't, we have public comments, but I don't see any public here or on the participants. Still looks like 2, just us. We'll give that a shot again at the end of the meeting. We are not really expecting our city council liaison, as I understand it, or she may patch in remotely. If she does, we'll maybe find a convenient spot to stop and build that into the agenda. But for now, I think we're going to skip that and move right to old business. And the first one is the comprehensive plan update, climate policies inclusion. Hopefully folks had a chance to review the packet. We've got 3 different sections where the climate policies have been sort of draft included: land use, environmental quality, and shorelines, and community services, public safety. And then as time allows, we're going to look at capital and utilities. And again, as time allows, we look at transportation a little more, we'll see how that all goes. So. All right, how do we want to run this from here?
I could run through the materials that you have a little
That'd be
bit,
great.
because there's so many. The packet was a little difficult to put together. We did a new version, and it's on Municode. It starts with the usual update from SCJ that kind of is a running schedule of what we've done and where we're at for tonight's meeting. Then there are 3 documents titled climate policies. Those are 3 elements that have been here at Planning Commission for initial review and amendments. And then we had a discussion at Planning Commission and at the Climate Action Committee about including some policies into the periodic update. And this draft, these 3 documents attempt to do that in advance of the climate element, which is another year-long effort that we haven't started. So the first item is 3 elements that you've already discussed. The strikeout underlines are those discussion items. And then the red colored, I believe, highlighted ones are the climate policy inclusions for tonight.
All right, so I think as we go through this, so where you see sort of regular track changes, those should reflect previous discussions. That doesn't mean we can't make changes still. Tonight's focus is on the climate additions that are called out by Christina in red text, as Mark said, I think. And but I would say we could also just kind of quickly scroll through. Like, I picked up a few things that I just wanted to note for future where we maybe missed something earlier or something I wanted to suggest in some of the earlier parts that we've already covered. Don't want to spend too much time there. But did anybody see anything in the sort of first 1, 2, 3 pages of the land use element before we get to the climate or the contributions that come from the climate policies? Nothing new so far? Okay, so I think the first one I see that is added for tonight is policy LU 1.6. I'm actually looking at the Word version, not the PDF version, because I was looking at the Word version that I received first. And so that's what I've got in front of me. But 1.6, collaborate with all residents during the land use planning process, e.g. comprehensive planning, ordinance development, and intentionally connect with people that have not historically been engaged, including racial and ethnic minorities, those with lower incomes, youth, seniors, and others. So my understanding is this red text is the new stuff, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Any
New in a sense to the planning commission.
Right.
But very much in the climate action plan at the policy level.
Right.
Not necessarily the tasks.
Okay. Any comments on that? Changes, suggestions, questions for our consultant? Follow that with the next one. I'll just offer that I found some of the additions to be, and I don't mean just the land use element, some of the others. There was some redundancy either with things that we already had in there, and in some cases redundancy, and they offered a few different policies that seemed pretty darn similar, but one was maybe even clearer than the other. So that's the one thing that jumped out at me overall. So I'll try to flag those when or flag the ones that caught my attention. Any comments on this 1.7? Provide opportunities for inclusive public participation in the land development process. Okay. Rolling right along then. Let's see here. There's our next, and again, if you see something that I'm skipping over, please, stop me. Let's see here.
And I would hate to, I'd go off topic, but I would again just ask the group to consider, language that says something like expansion of commercial zones within the city to better support a healthy and diverse mix of uses, slash zones. Just a consideration, just we can table that, but I think that with the housing discussion that occurred last time, like all of this stuff really can't happen. It stays in the dream state unless we have truly, I know we're gonna talk about capital facilities, but if we can truly help the city generate some sort of revenue.
So there's the section on economic vitality, which probably, I'm guessing maybe that's where that would go. So that starts with 5.1, land use 5.1. So let's hold that for just a second and let them, because we have a couple in section 4 here still in the climate, or 1. And this was really pretty minor. There was a suggestion on LU 4.4 to encourage transit-oriented development. And that was really just the addition. So we had to encourage higher densities of multi-unit development and so on and so forth. They added this term. It is it is kind of a known term, but I don't know if we have any opinions on whether it's almost too specific a term. I'm comfortable with it, but I just want to see if anyone has a reason why they wouldn't want that in here. As a main thing.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with what that means. What is transit oriented development?
Mark might know the more kind of real definition, but it really is focusing development around newly developed significant transit hubs, stations, light rail stations, big transit parking rides, things like that. But I don't know what else.
Well, I don't want to get too technical. It's lengthy, but what I can say is the last 2 legislative sessions, they've had housing proposals related to transit-oriented development that did not go through. The housing bills did, and the short order was put density and bulk and mass near transit facilities. And then every level of detail after that. Got it. Okay.
Just one observation in those discussions. Sometimes what has happened, I think, before these recent legislative sessions is that transit-oriented development or naming that has sometimes been a tool that people have used to say, great, let's do it there and not in the rest of our neighborhoods, right? Like, let's just do density near transit and not density elsewhere. And that may be part of what the legislature was thinking when they did pass the middle housing and things like that, but did not push this. But that's just I'm maybe reading something into it. So do we want to discuss this further with our consultants before saying what we want to do with this? I guess like any implications.
I think it's just to ask next week. So there about the investments. I guess the part that tripped me up on that one was not necessarily that edit, but the old edit that expands the city's existing green resource for all residents. I don't know what the green resource is in the context of this policy.
I read this tree canopy
Oh,
or, the vegetative.
I didn't catch that either. Or I had not caught that. I'm confused by that as well.
I'll put that out to Christine. Discuss.
Yeah. So here that I can share.
One thing I was a little confused by was land use for residential neighborhoods facilitate the quality, form, and function in diverse residential neighborhoods.
I'm sorry, which one are you on?
It's just the goal for residential neighborhoods facilitate the quality, form, and function in diverse residential neighborhoods.
It's the standardized language that replaces community character.
I know. We
Or neighborhood character,
yeah.
From the King County, countywide planning policy vision 2050.
Or, I mean, it doesn't really matter to me, but just cut out diverse, just what about the function of residential neighborhoods? Then I'm not sure what. I added word that was either.
All residential neighborhoods or.
Yeah, just
Right,
function
isn't that what it's doing, facilitate? It's just in all, yeah, all
residential.
in all. With the 4.4. One of the things that there's a policy, I think it's in the transportation, but if the goal is higher density and that's a real priority, then I think that layering on additional layering on additional things that have to be done that might then not allow that higher density to be built is something that we need to think about. So if adding on a transit-oriented development will then put an additional barrier to making multi-unit development because it's an additional financial hurdle or additional something hurdle, just something to think about, whether what the priorities are and how that's think of.
Yeah, I mean, my initial reaction was whenever you add a label, you're in some way potentially narrowing what the policy is getting at, which I think is a little different than kind of what you're saying too. Like if you're putting a specific box around something, then that could limit what else you can do. So I think that'll be a good one for us to talk about. I'm sure we understand that. Okay. Moving on down the packet, anyone seeing anything?
So coming back to your
Oh, I'm sorry.
economic vitality.
Yeah, right. So Commissioner Lee, you had there's policy, there's 5.1, which is a mix of uses in commercial zones. But it sounds like you're speaking more about increasing commercial zones or having more diverse commercial zones. Or
mixed use or commercial along, Bothell Way or Ballinger Way. Because we're talking about, those are the areas where we're increasing, option 2 or 3, whatever we decided with housing. Those are the targeted areas where the transit hubs are. It makes no sense that we not only are highly residential as a city, but then we're gonna add more residential and, how does this infrastructure get paid for? And to really help the city, and we're already, I know, struggling from an infrastructure, from a financial standpoint, but to increase the commercial base is really, I think, something that will help, just.
Mark, I mean, it's been a while since I've looked at what is the economic development section there chapter, is that, I just want to make sure
Yeah.
this
That may
sounds
be-
like something good to address, I'm just wondering if it's there
Yeah.
also or not.
That may
I
be
mean,
very
this is the land
related.
use piece, so we may need to.
Yeah, it could be both. In both areas without being redundant. We originally were scheduled to have economic development element tonight. But that was 2 months ago, and now everything else is different. But for June 6th and June 11th, that's the remaining one. So you will have a shot at that element for the economic aspect of it. And you can capture the land use aspect of it here.
Yeah, I primarily in land use, I see it in the zoning map, and that's really, that would have, because I know it's adopted by the council, the current zoning map, but it would be a change to that map. So that's why I brought it up here. But I think it's kind of, paves the way for the city to kind of think about maybe looking at that map and making it less top heavy residential.
Would you be willing, Commissioner Lee, to look between now and the next, or at least before we get to economic development, look at the current economic development section with an eye towards whether how we should phrase something in this section, and we'll,
Sure, I'd be happy to come up with language.
that'd
yeah,
be great.
and-
And then we
Just
can
go ahead.
discuss that and see
Yeah.
how everyone feels about it. I made a note in here, I don't know if you'll want my notes, Mark, but I'm just making a note here that we may want to add a policy. After Commissioner Lee takes a look at that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you for that. All right, now scrolling down, section 6, public uses. No new stuff there. Healthy communities. Not seeing anything there from new additions. And anyone else? I'm kind of going fast through here, so stop me if you see something. I had a comment down at number 9.2, policy 9.2. And this isn't new, but it just caught my eye. The last sentence, I don't know what it means when it says to buffer pedestrian and business vitality. Promote extensive use of sustainable landscaping, buffer pedestrian and business vitality. That I just don't know what that means. Anyone?
I flagged that as well.
The discussion at CAC was more around heat sinks. Large parking asphalt. Auto oriented. The same discussion at tree board was. Bent towards aesthetics, but tree canopy. Even though it's commercial and a transportation corridor, it was. It's adjacent to the lake, it's the center of town. Don't make it so commercial that there's no green there, has a climate impact and an aesthetic tree canopy. It was meant to summarize that at the policy level.
Okay, I mean, I get that goal. This last phrase is not working. I mean, I'm trying to read this as, say, a resident who doesn't look at this stuff, and that just doesn't mean anything. I mean, it's just confusing.
Yeah,
Buffering
we could
pedestrian
amend it.
business vitality. So I'd like to maybe check that with our consultant next week.
Okay.
And
Is a really basic reading of that could mean have landscaping between the sidewalk and the building. Have landscaping between the commercial building and the pedestrian trail.
right, okay,
But the conversation at CAC at tree board was climate.
okay.
So but this wording, if it goes forward, it's to me, placemaking or aesthetics.
Can I propose something else that I threw in there instead of that last sentence? 'Cause I know what they're trying to say, but the last sentence, or excuse me, the sentence reading and the connecting street network instead, possibly putting the connecting, sorry, doesn't make sense, and meaningfully connect them with all modes of transportation. And then in parentheses, provide safe and buffered non-motorized accessibility. Instead of just the including accessibility. Provide safe and buffered non-motorized accessibility. I think that kind of. I don't know.
And I'd like to discuss with Christina. and
Yeah, 100%.
Finalize that, okay.
Right, safe and buffered. Well,
Buffered non-motorized accessibility.
I'm just writing this down, not as a specific proposal yet, but something that we want to remember to talk with her about as we sort this
Just
one out
options.
next week. Yeah.
100%, yeah. It's like, yeah, I flagged that too. It was just kind of,
I mean, you know, I work for government, so I can write obscure, you know, text that regular people don't understand. That was the stuff out of me. I'm like, okay. All right, let's see here. Scrolling down, looks like I had a few others that I don't know what it means. So land use 11, climate commitment. Unless somebody had something on 10, I believe that was the equity section that was prepared for us. But if nobody has anything there, 11, promote development that advances climate planning. I'm not sure what climate planning means. Does it mean planning for climate adaptation? That's definitely something that I do understand. Resilience, greenhouse gas emissions reduction, that's great. But I don't know what advancing climate planning is.
It almost seems like it would be better as climate objectives.
Right, with the plan that will be adopted, but, yeah. That advances the city's climate action plan.
Okay, I'm just typing in consider climate objectives. Or maybe something like planning for climate adaptation, something like that. Since tonight is a working session, we don't have to nail down the language, right? We're kind of teeing up things for Tuesday and then.
But I like your notes, because on Tuesday, it's helpful to remember some of the great words that were spoken tonight. Without having to go back.
And I'm not gonna be here, so I'm gonna have to share, or probably not gonna be here, so I'll be sure to share these with people. Anything else on, okay, that was the goal. So, okay, policy 11.1. I had another one that I'm just not sure what community-wide driving means. Are they just trying to say reduce kind of vehicle miles, or what are we, I don't understand. I've never heard the term community-wide driving.
Or on how the land use designations do that.
Yeah, I mean, that, the last part, kind of first mile, last mile, that part means something to me, but, yeah, I'm not exactly sure.
You're talking about transit,
How would changing land
wide
use?
driving bus.
Sorry,
Are they talking about busing? That's what came to my mind when I read that.
I mean, it's, I don't know if it's just getting at, you know, putting, you know, having density near transit. I mean, it's kind of getting back to transit oriented development. That does reduce the need to drive. I just didn't, like, I didn't really understand this phrase.
I think it relates to the reduction of greenhouse gas emission under the goal. I think that was.
But do they just mean reducing basically vehicle miles driven? I mean, is that,
And
Oh, I see.
how could a land use change affect either of those things?
I think just by, I think that the logic here is that by having higher densities of people in locations where they don't have to drive to get to transit and things like that. So again, kind of clustering our higher densities near transit. I mean, that's what I think this implies. And I think we're capturing that in other places of the goals, but maybe.
Perhaps clarification, because
Yeah.
does it, like, how does the land use designation reduce that? Is it through the transportation networks, multi-mode transportation, is it work from home initiatives, is it?
Right. I mean, one thing I'm trying to kind of remember and respect is that, you know, this is pulling things out of climate plan and trying to drop them in here where they fit. And some of them are gonna actually be pretty redundant with things we already have in here, but using different words. So I don't wanna just outright scratch things, but I'd like to make some of these just need some more clarity. So I made a note here that is this about reducing vehicle miles driven? And kind of the question is, what's the mechanism? For land use to. Get at this. Okay.
I do have one more, is it land use 10.1?
Oh,
If we're finished with that.
sure, yeah, I skipped over the 10th, so. no
Yeah,
problem.
I'd like to mention this one. I think it would just read better if it said, connect with people who self-identify as, people of color instead of the black, like why black and indigenous as opposed to all the other, is it, but I think it just reads better, it just reads more equitably if it's just who self-identify as people of color.
Any objection to, at least proposing, I guess tonight we're not really striking things formally, but proposing to strike black, indigenous and other. Anyone?
Let's ask the consultant about that next week. I'd love to hear their thinking. My understanding is that referring to three groups as distinct recognizes the distinct experience each of those three populations have in the country. Black people, with the history of slavery in the US, indigenous people were here before this was the US, and people of color who have a different experience. But I'd love to hear from the consultant their perspective is.
Yeah, my sense is this is probably kind of how this type of language is now throughout some of the countywide planning policies and some of the state language. That's probably just mirroring language, but let's just confirm that, because I do think sometimes these don't read as well as something simpler, but let's check and just make sure there's not a very specific reason to do that. Thank you. Okay. So we talked about 11.1, 11.2. There's another new one, encourage land use policies and regulations that enhance the community's adaptive capacity, resilience, and social capital. Thoughts there? Or questions? I don't know what they mean by social capital in this context. Or I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how land use policies and regulations enhance social capital. Can anybody tease that apart for me?
I mean,
It's just, I think it's a term of art that is maybe out of context here or something. Or maybe we're just not fully understanding it, so I'm gonna. Yeah. Oh, I already commented.
Is that like just bringing in other culture? Like other community events that capture different culture that we have here?
That's how I read it.
I think that's
Community
probably,
richness,
Yeah,
it's hard to describe, but
that's a hard one to put into words.
yeah. And I mean, my tendency is to sort of spend more words and actually say what it means, like you just, like you just sort of describe what you thought that it means. Then these kind of, this to me is like a buzzword type phrase. It's like, I don't know. We'll visit that on Tuesday. Okay, then 11.3, support developments that utilize clean energy or reduced energy consumption. Makes sense. Any
Does
further,
yours have consumption at the end of that?
mine does, mine's the Word version. That came maybe a day or two earlier, is that not in the packet version?
It's weird that they would be different at all. You know, the Word version.
Oh, you know what, never, I think I typed this in with a question mark.
Oh,
myself,
okay.
like,
You scared me.
okay, well, I guess I'm like, it's, yeah, sorry, that's on me. Support developments that utilize clean energy or reduced, I would just think it would say reduced energy use or something. But.
Yeah.
Like, something like that, okay, yeah, it's just a funky sentence. Okay, yeah, that was my bad, sorry if I confused you.
Go back and check my emails.
Well, that was my bad. Okay, so that was the volume one stuff for this land use section, then they've, next in the packet is volume two for land
And I'm
use, or at least
sorry,
in
can I
mine.
just, because I'm just wondering if that point belongs in land use at all, because wouldn't that be more appropriate in maybe housing? Because in the land use, we're not gonna be specific about the kind of developments. If that, kind of that detail, it'll just be more residential, commercial. So I don't know, maybe in land use, it is gonna get that specific about what types of.
In the future, in the building codes, as they update them. And any development regulations that come that encourage solar use and so forth, this would be in a very broad policy of encouraging those later regulations. It's not required now, but it's so general that if somebody were to apply right now and say we meet the currently updated energy codes, we'd say then that supports this policy. But it's very general.
So do you see any issue with it being in this section? Is that,
No, I've seen it before.
Okay.
Yeah, Bainbridge Island has that, and then it supports all
Okay.
their miscellaneous requirements that are a little stronger than the state.
Mark, did you see any, did you have any party with the policies that they have that are,
I don't,
yeah,
you know, I've read through them. If there was any note in my brain or hesitancy, it's that we're gonna do a climate element over the next year, which is the same policy level. I don't mind these being in there now, but they will be immediately relooked at. And if they stay in there, that's great. I don't envision they're gonna come out, so this is perfect timing. But then the decision will be keep them, condense them into the climate element, reword them. And that will be done with the climate policy advisory team and then the planning commission. So if you're familiar and you're fine with them here, the odds are you'll be familiar and fine with them then, but have a much more detailed look into the climate. But no individual amendment. Yeah. There are a couple that are noted as implementation items.
right.
So a discussion could be made, are they policy enough? Or are they really climate action plan tasks or something in between? But nothing was surprising. I think it honors what that committee did.
so,
Yep,
so volume two, background analysis. Scrolling down to locate first officials in red, but if you see something else.
Oh, and this volume 2 background analysis, I don't know that they updated for climate policies. And I know that they were short on time, so it may be that the volume 2s that are included just weren't color coded from the past.
I got you.
So they would represent the colors from the last time you saw
Okay,
land use. No, okay, I'll proceed to make sure, but I am absolutely, oh, no, that's the next one.
Is there?
Environmental quality, yeah, so I think that's the case for land use volume 2.
okay, so in that case, we don't need to look at it with an eye towards climate stuff right now. Did anybody in your review of materials just spot anything that caught your eye in that volume 2 that needs to be addressed now or later?
This is just a minor thing though, just with growth targets, I thought, shown in table 11.1, housing must be accommodated at several, but I thought, for a reader, if they knew that as part of the state mandates, that housing has to be. So just as part of the state mandates, housing must be accommodated. And it just reiterates that first sentence where, really this is.
I got you.
I could add a reference to GMA. Growth
Yeah,
Management Act.
it does have the Growth Management Act in that same paragraph, but basically it's got a lot of, weird legislative, but it just says, table 11.1, housing must be accommodated at several affordability levels, but it's because we're talking about the county, the GMA, the state.
So something like as a result of these
State,
countywide and state policies,
Yeah.
housing must.
yeah,
Okay.
so it's our obligation at the local level to meet those. That was just a minor.
No, I- that's what the- All right, if nothing else on this volume 2, we're gonna switch over to, I think, environmental qualities next. Okay. Right on the first page is the first item that I see, which is under policy EQ 1.4 psych. There's an addition to the existing language. I'll just read it so we can hear it all at once. Use the best scientific information available in an adaptive management approach to preserve or enhance the functions and values of sensitive areas through regulations, programs, and incentives. The new edition, implement integrated and interdisciplinary approaches to environmental planning strategies. This calls out specific reference to CAP 3.1. Thoughts on that? Anyone? Fine. Okay. Then just right below that, 1.6, incentivize lead building standards, low impact development, stormwater infrastructure. That's the addition. I actually like that addition. Don't know if anyone else has a note about that.
So that's a kind of a type of stormwater.
Yes, it's sometimes referred to as green stormwater infrastructure. You're looking at everything from small developments might be as simple as kind of rain gardens and things like that, but there are other tools also to basically focus on cleaning the water better, not just sending it off site. So working through really good soil to clean the water before it then goes into sort of a stormwater system. Definitely a big thing that's being focused on now, because we're learning how toxic our stormwater is. So,
Just now.
well, we're learning some new things. We're actually learning some new things, like
There's
Yeah,
research now.
yeah, the tire stuff is just brutal on salmon. It's right. So any objection, I'm fine with that one, but so I'm not seeing any objection there. I had a question for the consultants on policy 2.3. Is promote education efforts that demonstrate the connection between drainage activities and the city's shoreline. I don't know what that means. Or what they mean by drainage activities. Any guesses?
I'm guessing that they're just wanting to show people that what goes down your drain, you know, leads to, so just kind of the whole,
Okay,
I'm guessing that's what.
A good example would be the storm system rates that have this trout and the salmon picture
right.
that graphically remind you that what goes in that grate goes to Lake Washington. That's the simplest one.
Okay.
Or that
Okay.
all things space of the drain into the lake, everything runs down.
I got you.
It's roof runoff or parking lot runoff.
I guess I never thought about those as activities.
Yeah,
That was, so maybe there's a term here that I get it.
maybe
Okay.
like the water path from drain to shore to lake or.
And when I hear city shoreline, shoreline management plan immediately comes up, and those policies are adopted in the SMP. But that mirrors that.
Yeah, this was just a strange one for me, being in it's in the shoreline development and access section. And then this term drainage activities, okay, let's make a note here. We think this means sort of that, drains to the lake type stuff, or, drains to.
Because the education efforts is really what the policy is getting at.
I personally I think it's important to link activities that occur further, say at Horizon View. And as simple as, pouring, paint in your, doing a painting job. But yeah, and it says goal EQ to protect the city's shoreline while accommodating reasonable and appropriate uses near shorelines. But it also, I think the sentiment is to also link activities further upstream is how I would read that. But
Yeah, so
perhaps
this-
it can be worded better to.
Yeah, or like even how kind of upstream inputs, to the drainage system affect water quality all the way down to the shoreline. That's something, again, some kind of simpler, maybe a little longer, but simpler language. Okay, let's make sure that's what it meant, and then we can recraft that. I'm right now skipping down to 3.5, EQ 3.5. That's the next spot where I saw something. Anybody have something before that? Okay. And this is really kind of terminology. Mark, I don't know what you think about this, but and this is, I think, from our existing, old language, the term septic systems is really not the term that's being used anymore. It's usually on-site sewage or on-site sewage treatment systems. OSS is the term of art, and the reason that sort of matters is septic is actually a particular type of technology, and a pretty simple one. There are other on-site sewage treatment systems that aren't called that. So I just wonder if we could move to, and I asked the consultants what the best term is, but the one I've heard for the last decade is OSS, on-site sewage system. Any thoughts, Mark, to making that change?
I'm old, so I say septic, but I'm not an expert, so OSS is probably better, and it's used a little lower.
And are all of them, do we need to prioritize to make them part of the larger sewer system or have some of the on-site technologies? Are they superior? So it really be,
I wouldn't say any are superior, but there are trade-offs, right? One of the. If your on-site systems, this is where they fail, is that people don't actually know how to take care of them. If they were actually working the way they're supposed to and sited well, there's a benefit to them in that they're releasing that water into the groundwater. Right, it's going into the soil instead of being piped out to the sewage treatment plant and into Puget Sound. So, like, if you think of, if you have a property where all of your, potable water goes into your septic field, then you're kind of adding water to the groundwater table. So there can actually be benefits but again, it hinges so much on, you have a big enough drain field? Have you pumped out your tanks? Do you maintain your system? And what we're finding nowadays is a lot of people are buying, moving into areas. They may realize they're on septic or on site, but they have no idea what that means. You have to change the toilet paper. You have to change the chemicals that you use, change the soaps you use to be sort of responsible using those systems, and people they don't know that. So in that case, it is better to get them on sewer. That's my opinion, but
In the development regulations for every city, there's always a distance requirement.
oh, if you're close enough to a
Exactly.
sewer trunk line,
Shall.
you shall connect when it's sold or
And
whatever.
if you're subdividing, that's automatic.
Yeah. Okay.
But there are outliers everywhere, I shouldn't say everywhere. That are due to distance or they were developed 80 years ago, critical areas. So there's always gonna be a couple that stay on OSS.
I will say, I noticed looking at the maps of where we have OSS versus sewer, and ironically, some of the biggest clusters of people still on OSS are in some of our most sensitive areas. Like over by Grace Cole Park, those huge wetland complexes up there. Almost that whole neighborhood is on it, or probably 2/3 of the neighborhood is still on OSS, where most neighborhoods, there's like a house here, like I've got my next door neighbor is on OSS. They're the only ones on the whole street that are still on that. And that's, it's probably fine. It's a big lot if they take care of their system, but I mean, I do support in general the policy of getting people on the sanitary sewer, but there are some trade-offs, so.
Where did you see that map? Is that?
It was, I think it was in one of our packets or on the city's,
Oh, okay.
might have been in the, there's that map page, where there's a bunch of different maps on the city's site. It might have been there. Yeah, I don't remember. I'll try to get it. Okay, so
the additional red, should that be
Yeah.
a separate, policy, or it's just, that just becomes so long and it's a little bit different?
yeah, and what's kind of interesting or unclear to me about like, what do we do? Once it goes through a pipe to the street, it's not the city's. It's King County Wastewater Treatment Division, their pipes, their systems. So obviously, we don't want them to have sewage overflows in our waterways, but I'm not sure what supporting planning to ensure no sewage overflow. I'm just not sure what that statement gets us, although I totally agree with the objective. I mean, old sewer lines, they all use gravity, right? So they're all in these creek ravines. I mean, under Perkins is a giant sewer trunk line. right there by McAleer Creek. I mean, that's where it runs, so it's definitely vulnerable. You know, the creeks are vulnerable to sewage spills, but I just don't know what this gets us.
Would this be better in facilities? Because it talks about coordination outside facilities that maybe should be better there.
Mark, do you know how much do cities sort of weigh in on, in this case, King County's wastewater treatment? Like, how much do we coordinate with them, or do we just kind of assume they're doing a good job through our city?
Yeah, separate jurisdiction, but when I read that, it's something I would grab from our policy document in support of a grant or a rationale
I see.
and recommendation,
I see,
as opposed to
Okay.
something we would go do.
okay,
Because if we went to go do, they would say, whoa, separate agency. But
okay,
it could be just, supportive of intent to support their efforts.
yeah.
Funding,
Yeah, I certainly don't object to the goal. I was just kind of curious, like you, is this a separate policy or does it fit here? I mean, maybe that's the question. Is it different enough from the rest of the state? The rest of the statement is really about moving people off of OSS to the sanitary system. That is I think, a legitimate policy. This next one feels like it could be separate, so maybe that's just a comment.
and it's not only separate, but it could be in either capital facilities or utilities.
Right,
Because, the function is not city.
Mhm.
But I'll flag it for discussion change.
okay. All right. Thanks for touching it. Okay, this next one, 3.6, I couldn't help myself. This is work that I'm involved in, so I had to wordsmith it. Or propose to wordsmith it. So maintain and has natural drainage system to protect water quality, reduce public costs, protect property, and prevent environmental degradation. And then I think the language was including supporting riparian restoration. I run that little say including supporting stream restoration because riparian planting is just one piece of stream restoration. It's an important one. But so I'll just read what I wrote and see if there's any immediate reaction to that. I left it all in here as trapped. I said, including supporting stream restoration, including planting of native species in riparian areas. And then left the with or without partnership with community organizations. I thought that last phrase was a little odd.
It is.
Like with or without, with or without, I think what they're saying is the city needs to do this. And not just rely on the stewardship foundation. I think basically, I think that's what they're saying. But I think it reads a little funny. Does anybody have an idea for? Should we say that differently or do we leave it? So I guess question one, any concerns with how I rewrote it with around the stream and riparian for that?
Sounds good.
Okay. And then this last phrase, partnership, we have a new, there is David.
Still
All right. Still driving, all right.
What about while fostering, or while promoting partnerships? While fostering partnerships with community organizations.
My guess is that there was a reason for them to say it this way. And I'd like to understand it before rewriting that piece. I don't know if there's a perception that the city is entirely relying on community organizations. Maybe, I mean, I don't have that perception. I don't know what to think about it, but maybe they really specifically wanted to highlight that the city needs to work on this regardless. So
Could be, because Brian Saunders is on the city.
I don't know why.
Councilmember Saunders has been
Oh,
He's on stewardship. So he's either on stewardship and attends CAC, or he's
I
on
got you.
CAC.
I got you. Okay.
So my
Yeah,
guess is
I'd
it's
like
very
to- I'd like-
specifically chosen.
Yeah, it's probably true, so let's,
There is, I mean, it's not that I really have a huge, but it does have a sense of some sort of bitterness or something.
there's something
And
there.
I don't know if it's necessary. We could just put a period there and
Not have that.
we could just not have it, but then we could prioritize doing this without the, yeah.
Without
Because
some
when I
stuff.
read that, I thought, I don't know what the issue is, but it's a little strange.
I mean, I think if the intent is, or if someone wants to say that the city should proactively seek, funds to do this kind of work, that to me is a good and fair recommendation that is maybe a standalone policy. Because there are ways to do that. There are lots of grant programs out there, tons, especially for riparian work. It takes effort to go after them and then implement them and all that, but I like, yeah, so let's maybe dig into the meaning of this one before we reframe it. Everybody okay with that approach? We might have lost David because we're back down to 2. All right. Okay, we'll keep going. 7, 3, 8. Okay, I had something on 3.9. And I again offered edit. Now I bet we have David again.
Yep.
Yep. Hey, David, are you there?
I am.
Awesome. All right. Thanks for joining. I'm chairing tonight as Chair Alvarez McCartney is not feeling well. We are right now in the environmental quality section, going through the proposed edits that have to kind of incorporating the climate work and wording, and we're kind of going through mainly those changes and not the entire section as a whole. And right now we're on policy EQ 3.9, which has to do with coordinating with regional agencies and neighboring jurisdictions.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. So on this one, I offered some language that is in the volume 2 at a previous meeting, highlighting the fact that the city has been involved, not just in this, like here they talk a lot about this, it's called the Lake Ballinger, McAleer Creek, something collaboration. But the city's also been involved for 25 years in watershed-based salmon recovery efforts throughout Lake Washington and the whole much bigger watershed. And I'd like to see have that named. I think it's awesome that the city's been involved, they continue to be involved, and I don't know why we're just calling out this one thing. So what I suggested was adding a phrase, coordinate with the regional agencies and neighboring jurisdictions to improve regional surface water management and salmon recovery efforts, resolve interjurisdictional concerns, and implement watershed-based action plans. Just adding that, I feel like acknowledges that the city does do this and they're effective partnerships. And then in volume 2, I offered like a whole paragraph last time earlier describing the salmon piece, the work that the city's been involved in. So that's my suggestion that I'd like to add. If anyone have thoughts, concerns, okay,
It sounds good.
great. Let's see, policy EQ 310. Support the removal or retrofit of existing culverts and encourage daylighting of creeks wherever possible to restore natural waterways. I like it. Any other reactions or questions about that? Okay. All right. Keep rolling. There's under alternative energy goal 5. Oh, interesting. So I'm just thinking back to that one land use one where we were encouraging development with reduced energy use. Maybe that belongs here. Because we have an alternative energy section. So that maybe that's the home for that one that you were pointing out. Or I think you called that enough.
Land use.
Yeah, we had that land use one where we said encourage developments that use renewable energy or reduced energy consumption or whatever that one was that we talked about a little bit. It seems like that could be part of an EQ 5 instead of in land use. I mean, I think it's fine there to point out the crosswalk, but this might be a better fit.
LU 11.3.
I think that's what it was.
You know, personally, I don't mind the redundancy, just because it
Yeah.
kind of is like it's just, you know, I don't think people are going to remember every little policy, but then when they just kind of read it, they're like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, it just kind of blow flash.
Agreed.
Just, can I back up to,
Yeah.
sorry, EQ 3.11, I'd love to see the word drainage somewhere there, again, touching bases with that land use. You had questions about the drainage
Mhm.
issue, but really, you know, the urban stream that runs into the shoreline, I think just to reiterate the fact that this is all part of the drainage system, the drainage system within the area is important.
Like something like
As part of
and the effects of pollution on downstream receiving waters or something like that.
it's something to the effect of, you know, this, because it's like the hip bones connected to, but it's basically the drainage system. This, you know, the urban stream is not in isolation to the shoreline, is not in isolation to the drainage activity by Horizon View. Because the next course along this trajectory is the shoreline.
Okay. Would you be willing to try to rewrite or add to that one before next time? That would be great. I'm putting a note here just so that both the consultant and the chair can see what we were talking about, but if you took a stab at it, that would be great. Just
Actually, if we could just put about, you know, residential drainage activities. If we could just insert support public education programs about residential drainage activities and their relationship to urban stream contamination.
why just residential?
Because I think I read the last section as residential urban activities, the last in land use. And again, because we're like 90% residential.
That's true.
I mean, this is primarily who we're targeting.
I think part of it too is it's about kind of individual actions, right? Like everybody matters, each household, what you do with your car, how you know, all that stuff matters. But I'm gonna add a note, but if you wanted to try to reshape it,
Yeah, I could do that. Yeah.
that would be great. Good. All right. On EQ 5.1, there's a note here. They added the phrase for community solar projects. So public and private clean energy pilot projects such as comprehensive network of electric vehicle charging stations or community solar projects with the active participation of residents and businesses. Is the term community solar project well enough like understood. I take that to mean kind of more aggregated, looking at potentially more centralized solar in community as opposed to individual houses, or do you?
That's how I use it, yeah.
Okay. I mean, I don't have any objection, but I just want to make sure it's clear enough for readers. Is that
That's how I read it too.
okay? Any other comments on that one, on 5.1?
Just in this section in general, I think since we're talking about electric, electric energy, it'd be nice just to have an equity language to promote. Again, if we were talking about electric infrastructure, really prioritizing, this, providing it for multi-family, multi-density, multi-dwelling areas where you have, people may not be able to afford them. But if we could have promote that in some sort of policy.
Do we require electric charging stations for multifamily development or commercial, not commercial stuff?
If we do, not very strong.
There was a something, I don't know, maybe it was in transportation, and the one concern that I have with that is that what if that barrier then the multifamily housing doesn't get built, because if you have, I think that we've already heard that it's going to be difficult for developers to develop at all. And so if you put additional requirements, then what happens if we don't have any of the multifamily built? So
I would
just a thought.
I would suggest promoting that as a.
Promoting it,
Yeah, promoting that, just to have people reflect that. These are probably areas where if I can't charge or afford to charge, and I can only afford to live in multi-family, multi-dwelling units. And I can't charge my EV car, then it makes it harder for us to really promote clean energy. If you're living in multi-unit dwelling units, then you're probably going to buy a gas powered car because there's no charging station. So just if we could promote it, then it maybe sets kind of our mindset for recognizing that aggregation.
I think there's also, like we've heard here, but also just in conversations with people in the community, the developers, one of the big things that's different, our code around just parking spaces, right? We require too many parking spaces, and that's one of the big reasons people aren't building big, developments in LP, because a parking spot costs about $50,000 per space. And other cities aren't requiring as many parking spots per unit as we are. That's my understanding. So how it ties into this is that I'd be curious if staff could maybe look into what do our neighboring cities require around EV charging. Currently, I mean, and I'm not saying we need to do what they do, because I totally hear your point. And yet, if I believe it's starting to be fairly standard in a lot of cities to require, a certain percentage of spots for EV. I wouldn't be opposed to that, but I'd like to know what are our neighbors doing? What Shoreline doing? Kenmore, Bothell, Seattle, they're so big, they have different, kind of drivers, but anyway, I'm just curious, but I don't disagree with your point at all.
And that primarily will be commercial multifamily.
Right.
The new energy codes that are about to be adopted here, but were adopted by the state. For every new single family, or I can't use it. For units of that sort, it has to be pre-wired for EV charging. You don't need to have the wall unit, but it will be pre-wired behind in order to. So I'm not.
Gotcha. So
Worried about
it's
the
basically
single
buried in there.
Yeah.
You have to have it in there.
Yeah,
Okay.
but for those other more dense commercial type land uses, parking discussion, then I'll check and see what their
Great.
standards are.
Good. And maybe there's more about this in the transportation area, but Okay. Um,
Low residential density.
That's right.
It doesn't roll off.
It's gonna take,
Yeah,
it's gonna take some time.
That's gonna
before
be
we-
hard.
Yeah, it's gonna take some time. All right, let's see. I scrolled down too far. Okay, there was another 5.5 encourage businesses, residents and new developments to utilize electric or solar energy.
Electric energy.
Do they mean electric over gas, or what are they? Curious what they mean by that.
My guess, the way I read it is electrification. It's all those building code discussions in Berkeley about. And, looking about limiting gas.
Right,
Battery.
I wanna confirm that this is what they're getting at. That I think blew up in Berkeley, I think they had to.
They just
evacuate.
repealed,
They
yeah.
repealed it.
Yeah.
Everybody know what we're talking about, the city of Berkeley, California, they passed an ordinance to ban gas stoves and single family, and I don't know if maybe gas furnaces too, maybe, but gas stoves specifically, and apparently that just got repealed after a court ruling, so kind of interesting to see where all that goes. But I'm gonna make a note here.
One thing that I remember from quite a few times before, but we've had mentioned that a lot of our electric power was from hydro, and that any additional, if we reach capacity, then it goes back to burning coal. So I would still really like to know where that threshold was, and
Yeah, it's, that is a real, that is a real thing. Do we have enough solar? I mean, have we built out enough solar and wind to make up for it if we have drought years and we don't have enough hydro? That's. The PSEs of the world, we're spending a lot of time and money thinking about that. So what I noted was, I just think we want to get an answer, is this getting at electric versus gas? Like, that's what we're trying to say. Okay. Scrolling down. Stop me if you see something, say something. There's one that's called out as an implementation plan, which is 7.4, develop a wildlife incident response plan. Is this like if we have a zebra loose, like they had up in North Bend, is that what we're talking about?
A raccoon got by a car.
Yeah, or deer, I guess is.
Deer, coyotes.
I'm a little unclear, is this new and it should be implementation, or is this an old one that Christina's saying this should be an implementation action as opposed to
Yeah, I don't
policy?
see this coming from CAC.
I don't either,
Oh, that's it.
maybe that's,
It may have just not been covered.
she's maybe just suggesting it needs to move, because she's called out a few other ones that way.
Okay.
I feel like we've talked about this before, and it was the wildlife corridor, does that ring the bell to anybody? Where they have to have a continuous stream of, like, green belts for the wildlife.
I'd be able to do it.
Does that ring the bell to you guys? No?
For this incident response plan, though, it seems like something a little different.
Yeah, that might
Oh,
just
sorry,
be
I
a
was looking at something.
color, highlighted typo.
I don't know if any of you remember this from about a year and a half ago, but there was a cougar in town. Like a big cougar.
Oh, you're not talking about this.
No, no, I'm talking about the animal.
Not my,
But that was actually in my yard, and I got the photo that was on. It was on like some of the neighborhood blogs, and the city posted about it and stuff. It was weird. I'm working at my desk and I look up, I'm like, I see something moving. So I look out into kind of the woods behind my house, and there's just this giant cougar just walking in the middle of the day.
Wow.
That was pretty wild.
So is that what the instant response plan?
I know, I don't know, I'm not really sure what this is, but
Exactly.
All I did
Who do
was-
you call?
I called the city and I called State Department Fish and Wildlife right away, just like, hey, you might wanna, be aware that there's a giant cat walking through our neighborhood right now. And it was not.
So
about-
what, you guys, what's the question about 7.4?
We got a little off track, but we were trying to, I think question one is should this be an implementation action, which is what the consultant pointed out, and then we're just not entirely sure what they mean by wildlife incident response plan. So
I got
a
it.
little,
Okay.
little clarity there would be good. Then I started storytelling, so sorry, I took us off track.
Got it. I'm just trying to catch up here. So now that I've stopped.
Awesome.
Other agencies do. It might be an element in our public safety plan, but whatever that safety plan is that coordinates police, fire.
Commissioner Lee, I think the topic you were raising is in the next one.
Possibly, I just.
It looks like there's maybe a numbering thing here. We have two 7.4s.
I think what it is, if she suggests this is an implementation item that comes out, and then she's moving other things.
Gotcha. That could be right.
But it could.
But this
equally
is
be
where
typos.
she talks about the contiguous wildlife corridors.
Yeah.
Okay, then I had to make another proposed edit to 7.6. Which is about fish habitat restoration efforts. I just reworded it because again, it was just talking about riparian areas. I said increase fish habitat restoration efforts along the city's stream systems and along the lake shore. And that encompasses things like riparian work, but it's not limited. Any concern or question there? All right.
Can we back up for just a moment to 7.1?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm just stuck on this, and I just develop empathy for wildlife. We can't develop empathy for anyone, or we can create a container where people learn empathy, but we can't develop empathy. So I just want to point that out.
Maybe, so I think this is all meant to modify the word promote educational programs that, and maybe it's promote or encourage empathy for wildlife. What do you think?
That's fine. Yep.
We'll put that as a potential. Encourage. Something like that. Okay,
Sure.
thank you.
Yeah.
All right. I think we're down to goal 8, forest canopy. This one is flagged as an implementation action.
I'm wondering if it would be appropriate to actually add the word officially recognize the forest canopy as a key city resource. It just gives it a bit more strength.
What would that look like for it to be officially recognized?
That the city council takes action towards recognizing the forest canopy as a key resource.
What
And
is
that they, that,
I understand.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I think he means it, just stylistically speaking in the thing, but I understand what you're saying, so like, how would the city council officially
Right.
recognize it?
I don't object to the point. Just wanted to kind of think through, all right, what does that mean? Anyone have
Mhm.
an opinion on adding something like officially or formally, or you could say through council action, or, there's different ways we could put it here. I think we could put officially for now.
Especially for now. I see the emphasis, whenever we talk about must or should or shall. If we just have recognize, you could say, I recognize the canopy, let's move on.
Yeah,
It's there.
no, it's true. It's
That's
true.
somewhere that kind of,
Elevates it.
yeah.
Okay. Sounds good. This is- All right. So, and consultant recommends that this 8.1 should be an implementation action. 8.2, doing a couple things, develop a tree planting inventory and maintenance program for publicly owned property that considers the species of trees that will be most successful, such as public rights of way. Then they add this pay special attention in the planting program to areas with vulnerable populations. I'm not, I mean, I think I can channel what is being thought about here, but it feels like a weird fit to me in this particular goal, or this policy. I mean, I think we're saying in many places that we need to emphasize kind of environmental quality and health and all that, especially in areas that are, we have more vulnerable populations, but this seems like a weird place to add this to me, or it doesn't flow very well. Curious what others think.
I wonder if it's coming out of, I know we've had prior discussion, regarding kind of the fees that some transit may be paying to cut down the 100 trees along all the way. And we've talked about maybe prioritizing, a program to have those trees planted in areas that tend to have low tree canopy
I got you.
coverage.
Yeah.
But the wording is challenging to get that meaning out of it, if that's what the intent was. So maybe we could ask.
Yeah, let's ask for some clarification. I think we had two different consultants write that one sentence. Because I see two different commenters here, so let's maybe get some clarification here.
That's a good catch.
All right. Okay. Then there's a string of new stuff. Starting at 8.9.
Can I make a suggestion for 9.8
Yes, please.
or 8? Is it 8.8? I guess I'm
8.8.
confused. Is it 8.8 or 9.8? It's like right before the one that you're
Yeah,
looking
Yeah,
at. So
the one
continue
that
to
says
balance.
continue to- Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, continue to balance tree conservation efforts with recognition of private property rights. Can we also add something there and public safety? Just because it's not just an issue of, like, sometimes those conservation efforts I feel like aren't really in harmony with public safety. And I'll give you the example of like how like the utility companies are afraid to cut back trees or remove trees because of our tree ordinances. And so trees that, are not going to be viable long-term are allowed to grow in areas that they shouldn't, or there's trees that are unhealthy that are probably gonna be coming down anyways, one way or another. And people don't wanna do it because they don't wanna go through the process of, trying to get a permit and that sort of thing. But I would really like to see also some more efforts regarding not just conservation, but also safety when it comes to these big trees.
Yeah.
So is it sufficient, Commissioner, to add and public safety at the end? Does that get at your comment, and then we can massage it further next time if people have more to add?
Yes. Yeah.
Great, thank you. All right, so I might suggest just for 30 seconds, since we've got about 10 of these, maybe everybody just read through these real quick, this set of red ones. I found some of these to be redundant with each other. So maybe let's just take a quick look through them, and then we'll start at the top and take comments. Okay, anyone want to offer anything starting from 8.9? Or not, sorry, 8 yeah, I guess 8.9 is the last one. And then, yeah, 8.9, anyone?
For 9 point, protect environmental quality and community resilience in a changing climate. I just have no idea what that really means.
Sorry, which one are you on?
9, EQ 9.
Oh, Q, I got it. Yeah, I tend to agree. I'm not entirely sure either. The words sound nice, but I'm not really sure.
Exactly. And then 9.1, identify areas with vulnerable populations and coordinate mitigation recovery planning efforts with those communities. In regard to what though?
So my comment there was, I think 9.3 is very similar, but much clearer.
Yes, okay, I agree.
What do others think about that? I just, when I read through these yesterday or whatever it was, I thought, why are these both here? And 9.3 actually makes sense. Or makes more sense. I didn't mean that to use.
I agree.
I agree,
Okay.
they could be combined. I think the only thing missing from 9.3 is the kind of element of coordination with those populations for those communities.
And the only comment I have about that is increasing tree canopy the only way to address mitigation with that?
So how do folks feel if I make a few comments here that we'd like to see? We'd like to kind of combine the intents of 9.1, 9.3, leaning towards 9.3, which is a little bit clearer, but just find a way to meld those. Does that sound okay? Great.
And asking for clarification, I think today's point on that.
I'm sorry.
And asking for clarification on that goal.
Yeah, let me write that comment here. So the goal statement overall, it basically isn't super intuitive here. I think was David's point.
I think they're referring to climate change. But again, I'm not sure either. The policies don't quite line up with the.
Yeah, David, for your benefit, since you weren't here at the beginning, one of the things we kind of discussed briefly is that these climate policies, you know, they've been kind of pulled in from another document, right? So in some ways, it's not surprising that they seem a little odd in some ways, like the context is a little bit different. So that's why we're kind of going through these and trying to identify where we can tighten things up or get clarity. Not because we're critical of the policies, but you know, they're kind of isolated in here, and that maybe makes them seem a little off in some cases. So
I suppose another opportunity for streamlining that or consolidating might be combining 8.9 and 9.4. 9.4 seems to be the same concept as 8.9. And honestly, I don't know. Maybe I'm just ignorant, but I don't know if we really have forests in like forest parks. We have trees, but I don't know if we have any that are sizable enough to count as a forest.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, there is.
So I'm seeing a few of these similar kind of issues. So let me, before I lose track. So you're saying potentially 8.9 and 9.4. Did I
Yeah,
get
I'd
that
be
right?
inclined just to go with the language in 8.9. I think that covers the concept well enough.
Okay, then I'm gonna make again, my comments are just gonna be passed off to Mark and to the chair and maybe the consultant, but I'm just gonna make a note here. So you're saying probably keep 9.4?
I'd keep 8.9.
Oh,
and I'd
keep it,
probably
okay,
strike
okay.
9.4.
Got it.
Unless anybody thinks we're missing something if we do that.
No, I agree.
Possibly strike. July, oh, enough of an explanation for now. All right, the other one that I had another kind of, isn't this redundant feeling, was there were two about waste.
9.2 and 10, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
or is it 10.2 and 9.2?
10.3.
Oh, and
waste, and then
Yeah.
the 11 is promote waste reduction, so that's a whole.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
Maybe we could do away
The-
with section 10.
Yeah, I think when I read those 5, I mean, they could probably be consolidated to 2.
Yeah, so I think instead of us trying to do that, let's just call it out here that it seems like we have several that could be combined around waste.
And I guess, and also I'm a little confused by the term sustainable food economy for LFSU. Not sure what that means. Does that mean gardening? Does that mean buying organic? Does that mean not wasting? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
So for the note on combining, what are we saying? 9.2, 10.2, 10.3, 11.1, and 11.2.
Correct, that's how I read.
Rattle those off one more time, please.
9.2,
Uh,
10.2,
okay.
10.3, 11.1,
Uh-huh.
and 11.2. And 11 for that matter.
Yeah.
And 10 for that matter.
Correct, yeah, that's, yeah.
But I agree with Commissioner Lee, maybe we should ask, like, what do they really mean by 10.1? I'm also confused by that.
Yeah, we might be missing a nuance there.
I think I would just add, and I think I agree with what everyone's saying, but I'm confused by everything between 9.2 and 11.2.
Yeah, I think that as we've just gone through, that's all the stuff that maybe could be combined.
Yeah.
Or clarified.
Okay, I think we could make that sort of bulk recommendation to just ask the consultant perhaps to kind of look at this set of things. And reduce it,
Yeah.
group it a little better. 'Cause yeah, it seems like there was a lot of duplication there. Okay, I think we made it through volume 1. For tonight, we have about 18 minutes left. And did you think the case was the same as at volume 2? They didn't pull in climate. Is that what you're saying, Mark?
Yes.
Okay, so we're not gonna, I think tonight then maybe we don't do that. I'll just make a note though, maybe for you, Mark, there were several spots in volume 2 where I just thought that they were referencing some pretty old data still.
Yeah.
And I had a few questions like, is this still the current, like the King County Surface Water Design Manual, it references the 2009 manual. Yeah, I'm not sure. So I think volume 2 overall in this section needs some revisiting.
One, we clarified on page 31 of the packet. Comment CL 18, there's a 2016 tree canopy.
Gotcha. Yeah, there were some other ones that just seemed kind of out of date. I'll say that I inserted some comments during my review, so I'll be handing those over because they're in here, but I don't know that tonight's the right time for us to go through those in detail, since we want to focus on the rest of what the consultants produced, but they're in here. All of them. All right, so what was the next chunk we're gonna try and look at? Was it capital?
Community services and public safety,
Got
still climate. But there's only 3. 3 plus whatever else you. Answers your background analysis is not updated.
Page 7, community services. Okay.
That section starts on packet page 37.
Sure.
I think that's what Christina had a question. She had a little letter. First,
The
Was
next
the memo-
letter is
or is that,
Right, there was a memo from her.
yeah, that,
Was that about this one?
capital facilities and utilities elements of the next.
Yes.
excuse me, pardon me.
Yeah. So we have one more climate policy
Got it.
document,
Yeah,
This
so
one.
yeah,
Right,
capital,
okay.
or community
but it's
service,
short,
Yeah. Correct.
and then we're on to that.
Oh, fine.
Okay, so. Some of these, all right, where are?
I did want to bring up one
Yes,
policy that was earlier, policy 3CS3 under youth. And I had suggested that we kept the original language, and I don't know if I was, uploaded, which that's the way it goes, but I thought that facilitate opportunities for positive interaction between youth and police and other public authorities was a good policy, and I thought that changing that to having police facilitated the de-escalation training just totally changes the mood and the intent of it, and I thought that it wasn't really. I would like, if we're only going to have one part where the police department is mentioned in this whole document, for it to be positive and not. And especially in the section with the youth, because they do the tots, Toys for Tots, and they come to National Night Out, the city events, and so That was just the thing that,
So I totally remember the conversation. I'm looking at these and like, where did we make that change?
so it's still changed to the, I thought
Which
that we
number?
should keep
Sorry.
it, yeah, CS 3.6. Sorry about that.
Six.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So it's still changed as opposed to going back to the original language.
I think it's February 13th, so I checked the packet. Verified my note. If it's a consensus to keep it, you could also note that tonight.
Yeah,
I feel like I just think they're different. I think the two things are different.
Especially under the youth, the de-escalation training seems, if that's a training that applies to all of their policing techniques. But this one is that under youth, that we want to facilitate good relationships with our youth and the police department, and so that seemed like a good thing.
you know, those youth these days, they're just.
I would support,
No, but I agree.
I would support splitting it into separate goals. I like the goal of supporting de-escalation training for the police. You could couple it with professionalism and de-escalation training if we felt that way, but I had shared a story at one of our prior meetings about an experience I had with the Lake Forest Park police
Yes.
officer that did not demonstrate professionalism or de-escalation. And I feel that that would be an important policy goal to reflect in this document.
So I have one suggestion, which would be to take that de-escalation one and move it out of youth and into the section that's titled, I think, residents. Presents everybody. Or no, the public safety vision. This is goal CS7 is public safety vision. And I wonder if that's a place to drop that. To place the de-escalation one. What do you guys think about that?
That works for me.
What do you think about that? Is there a better place for it? If we want to keep that, is that a better place for it than in the youth
I
section?
do think that it's a better place.
I think it belongs in CS2 because I read section 7 as more for emergency response and disaster.
Was that David? Did you try to jump in?
No, that wasn't me.
Okay. Just heard something on the mic. Okay.
The Commissioner Lee, you were saying in CS2.
Yeah, I think that's where their interaction with the community, but I do agree that it should probably be a second line item. And I agree with, you know, I too have observed that with, you know, watching how they've interacted with my children, my son, standing on our property and having the police yell at them for being out too late. So, but, it's on our property.
So, because I want to moving things between sections, I'd rather have the consultant keep track.
Mhm.
For my notes, I'm gonna write a comment here that move de-escalation either to goal 2 or goal 7, and maybe it could fit in either one. One is, you're suggesting the quality of life section. I was suggesting kind of the safety vision or whatever 7 is.
Yeah, I was reading 7 as more, you know, in relation to natural disasters.
Yeah,
emergency
no, you
response.
may be right.
That's why
You may
I
be
felt
right.
this was more public relations and,
Yeah, I think on balance 2 maybe is the better fit.
Okay,
Yeah.
move this policy to,
but I agree with commission, I like the positive language of its original form. It's-
With respect to you.
Yeah,
so I'm gonna write, move this policy to goal CS, under goal CS2. And restore policy to kind of original regarding youth and police. That's enough to get the point across to the consultant. Does that sound like what we want to say tonight? Okay. Thanks for reminding us about that. Okay, let's see here.
Could we back up to 1.8 real quickly?
Sure.
I would just like to know, how do we define disparities in this regard?
Fair question. What,
Yeah, maybe it could benefit from definition, but one comment and piece of feedback that came across in the survey results that were shared was that it felt there wasn't equitable access to parks or planning for parks in all parts of the town. So that could be, for example, a disparity if parks are concentrated in certain areas. I know we've also talked about access to the Civic Club being a private membership club, and some properties having access to that and others not, which is perhaps a reason for the Shoreline Park that the city's working on. But I think, you know, one reading of it would be, you know, if people aren't in close proximity to parks or services, you know, thinking of that as one of the lenses when new investments are made.
but I would say I agree with you, David, that just clarifying what the term means in this setting would be good, because it's not totally, it might just need a few more words.
Or examples?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, okay. All right, thank you for that. Okay, anyone else? That's something, there wasn't a lot that came from climate, but we're just keying in on some other things here in our discussion, which is fine.
Just my policy 7.2, it says maintain safer streets. I would actually, dare I say, promote safer streets.
Yeah, because they're not all.
We're not gonna
That's it.
maintain the safe.
Yeah. I'm with you on that. Okay. Other policies, we're down to 6 minutes, so we're not gonna get to capital today. And we should perhaps talk about the plan for Tuesday, so if anybody have anything else, and we're not gonna go to volume 2, we're just gonna stay up here at the top.
The comment, I was surprised by the language in the environmental design, the CPTD. Those were pretty specific. Those were very specific.
Was that down in volume 2?
Yeah, the volume two.
Yeah. I think I flagged it too, because I'm like, wait, what is this?
Very-
I actually don't. I had some issues down here in my in my comments. It might have been exactly that. Like, I'm like, why are these? I felt like that, maybe it was that CPTD thing. I felt like it's some, off the shelf package of stuff that's being sold to communities. And I have an issue with it. Maybe we'll have to talk about that at a future meeting.
Then there's just one typo.
Just one.
The territoriality section. Territoriality is a way of demonstrating community ownership neighborhood. So just-
Oh, yeah, I spotted that one too, but I think that was when I was starting to get really sour on the CPT
Yeah.
section. I'm like, you know what, this is, I have some issues here.
Okay.
And there was a ton of really old stats in here about crime and things like that. Okay, I'm just gonna make, while we're not talking about volume 2 really, I'm gonna make a comment here that a couple of commissioners really think we should talk about this CPT environmental design thing and whether it belongs in here. We'll have to come back to that, but just so we don't forget. Okay, we are at 4 minutes, so in terms of this discussion, thank you, everyone. I think we got some good stuff cleaned up. I don't think we had any public join, so we're not gonna worry about public comments tonight. What else? We didn't, so we got through, well, we got through A. All right, we didn't get to capital facilities. Just encourage everyone to read the latest versions of those and prep for Tuesday. Any new business? Do we have new business?
None, but if we have a minute, either this minute or next Tuesday, interested parties in the climate policy advisory team. But it's not urgent. But after Tuesday, it's urgent.
All voted.
And David expressed,
Yeah, I'll be the backup if you can't find.
and for the commission, the approved resolution was up to 3 CAC members. We got 3 plus an alternate up to 3 PCE members, and we can include an alternate things out there.
Okay.
But if the consensus is David, Lois, and Johnny,
Are you okay with that? Okay.
or did you want to be
Oh,
alternate?
were you looking for 2 commissioners and an alternate or?
It's up to you. Yeah.
As you want.
Up
yeah.
to 3 is fine.
Or I'm happy to be a backup too. I don't
Yeah.
really.
Right now, we.
Why don't we put our
members.
3 names on and we'll sort this out.
Okay,
Once we know the schedule, that might affect.
that's encouraging, because when we talked about it, you guys were all weary. Stop us worried we get done.
Well, it's hard to know.
Hopefully they primed us, people had time to think.
Yeah, good.
Well, it's hard to know until you know actual time commitment, actual schedule. Like, I could say I want to do it, and then if it's a conflict that's gonna be a problem for me, then I'm not gonna do it. So good that we have 3 people willing to do it, because we might have schedule
The
problems.
only thing is I don't know if my term expires or whether I'm extended. I think,
Yours is extended as planning commission will continue unchanged.
okay,
And this will be, interested parties to the mayor nominated, and then, through 2025. Separate.
Okay,
That was the critical business, and
Yep.
then, we reserve
you missed the side.
those 3 minutes we don't have to do next Tuesday. That's from our road.
anything new?
I've got new business question. Do you know who won the raffle or has it been?
Thanks for the reminder. I wanted to do it in a regular meeting
Perfect, okay.
with the thing, and so on the 14th, but I haven't actually drafted the agenda till now. But
I saw.
random number generation, boom, boom, someone chooses a number.
Okay.
And then we have the list with associated contact info.
Oh, cool, yeah.
And about 938 takers of the survey, but I don't know how many responded to that specific question. So I'll save it for some point. When do you want it on the 14th? At the beginning?
Why not?
Okay.
Will you come in a bikini?
And government, as we know, is, nobody would go to meet each other.
Think so.
Right. But we have the random number generator idea, pretty simple, and Christina has the, whatever we're gonna call it, list of contacts.
Yeah, I think we saw, it, yeah.
So it'll be truly random.
Great.
Yeah, fun.
So no citizen comments or any reports and announcements, any other announcements?
Not unless you have any questions. A lot going on, but
Right. Well, we hear you're close to maybe hiring a new person, but we'll keep our
we
fingers
don't know.
crossed.
We had a great interview and made an offer. And it's only Wednesday, so let's see what happens. at the end of the week.
So agenda, we'll be going over some of this stuff again and then getting into the new sections that we didn't get to today. I assume that's the agenda. for
The
Tuesday.
materials will be the exact same. I guess the question is, do you want the Muni code packet on agendas and minutes on the city website to include the same materials in the same order, plus survey, plus all the, we'll have a corrected capital facilities for sure. And stick with that as the packet. The survey is in draft form. I want to give it to you as soon as we have it, which is now. But I can't imagine we're gonna have any time on Tuesday to talk about it. So I'd like to leave that out of the pack.
I think that's fine. I mean, I think the package should focus on things that we're likely to get to.
Agree.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
So-
administratively, I think it's easier.
The other thing we've been kind of talking about, and I don't know if we've had an update on, are we gonna talk next week about community outreach in addition to the survey? Or are we gonna have an update from Christina at some point on that?
I think we asked for one.
Yeah, we did. And the directive was whatever remains, do it. And so the
Okay.
survey results not being part of it, I'll put in an agenda item for her to respond to.
Cause I know we had planned, like, you know, we had talked about very early on doing some town halls and doing some outreach, and I know before we know it, we're gonna be in summer and then time's
Yeah.
gonna get away from us.
Yeah,
And I think the council also expressed the desire to see that as well.
Exactly. So I would maybe even put that on the agenda if we could, before we get into all of the line item edits, because otherwise we might, as we usually do, run out of time.
Yeah.
okay, so adding that to next meeting. There's nothing else tonight. Entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the
A
meeting.
lot of material.
Thank you for stewarding us.
Thank you.
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good night.
Bye.